All right, well, let's get started anyway. The Etherpad should be editable, so feel free to add topics at the bottom and we'll get to them. I've just kind of tried to lay out the high-level projects that I've got in mind. And Zipper, there's a lot of work to continue. We've had some good contributions from other projects to add their own backends to RGW, which has been exciting. And we want to better support that by allowing them to load stores from shared libraries instead of building them in the Ceph tree. So there's a lot of work in progress to make that work. It involves shuffling around a lot of our CMake, but that part is coming along. There's also an interest in a standalone mode for RGW based on DB stores so that we can run in small configurations without any connected Ceph cluster. I think we still plan to use Ceph's config infrastructure, but just no MON connections. And there's also a project for a filter layer, which is essentially just building a store interface that wraps another store interface and kind of passes all of the calls through. And that way we can kind of compose these stores to add things like data caching and other intermediate layers to drive policy, for example. So there's work in progress on just the initial filter design, and then we plan to extend that for other uses. Any questions about Zipper or other comments here?
Is this filter the what you plan to add as a Lua layer, or is this something else?
Yes, this is where we would put the Lua, basically so that it sees every call into the store and can do things like redirect or access control, that kind of thing.
But this is describing, I think, not just a particular layer driver, but the ability to do them. We also say that we have a prototype trace driver that kind of is proving all the ops work.
So, yeah. In general about Zipper, what I'm missing here, and you mentioned config, but there needs to be a way to configure those, not just configure the backends, but manage, user management or whatever, we get from Rados Gateway admin right now, which at the moment is not functional. And that's really important for people to test it and to play with it. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I talked about how we want to compose these things, and we definitely need a way to configure and control how we set them up and arrange them. Not sure exactly where that configuration should live, but I tend to think that it belongs in the zone. But yeah, I think that would be a reasonable next step after we just get the filter layer working on top of the Rados store. Any other thoughts on Zipper? All right, S3 Select is the next one. And we've got multiple projects kind of in flight here as well. JSON support being able to do queries against JSON formatted objects is work in progress. And we hope to have that done by Reef, along with some integrations with Aeroflight, which I think is really interesting, but I don't fully understand the goals there yet.
I think that the Aeroflight integration is not necessarily related to S3 Select. It's a different front end. This is what I understand. That instead of, so if you have something that puts information in Aeroflight format, then instead of creating S3 objects from them, you can do that natively. I think maybe Gal can give more info there, but I don't think this is S3 Select specific.
It is and it isn't. You're right. It's a new front end, but it's a front end that understands that so instead of organized around columnar data sets, and has an interface called Flight SQL internal to it that allows you to do various kinds of restrictions, not unlike S3 Select on those data sets. So it has a kind of connection to S3 Select in this sense, at least in our implementation.
Okay, cool. And would this mostly just be for reading existing data out of S3, or would we try to use it to support writes to new objects as well?
Initially, I think it would be to get and to narrate and get flights. So in data sets that are in the S3 namespace. I don't know whether it has other operations right now or whether it might accumulate them at some point. But it's mostly for reading data, and it's mainly its first class client connectors are for Apache Spark. So it's definitely going to concentrate on reading data Apache Spark initially. But the Aeroflight I don't know what to call it. The Aeroflight protocol has interesting aspects. An Aeroflight can actually be an indirection that allows you to, and it can be a composite. So for example, an Aeroflight could be something that directs you to get components of the data set from a variety of other locations, and with some opaque authenticating or other contextual information that you would send to those other locations with the request. So it has a kind of a T10 or PNFS like character. But to your point, I don't know if it has any operators to put data. I don't think it actually.
Okay, so yeah, could accelerate the reads of a workload, but the writes would still go through S3. I think that's definitely the simplest model for RGW. All right, well,
Sorry, go ahead.
I look forward to discussing plans around Flight more in a refactoring call, hopefully in the near future. All right, moving on to the async refactoring projects. These have kind of been going on for quite a while, but it's hard to completely finish them. So I would like to focus and drive those projects all the way through. The async optional yield stuff, I think, is the main thing that we need to be able to run with a lot fewer threads than the default of 512. And Adam's awesome work on the Neo Rados client ties in really well with the async stuff from the Beast front end. Any other thoughts here? I think eventually with C++20 and its coroutines, we might look at using those either in addition to the front-end coroutines or as a replacement, but I still think that's a ways out. Okay, on to observability and tracing. A lot of great work has gone into getting Jaeger just integrated into Ceph itself, building the tracing primitives and testing their performance. Sounds like we're really close to having something that we can turn on by default in Ceph. And we'll want to start some projects in RGW specifically to thread these traces through the important call paths, like the app requests and multi-site especially. Multi-site pretty much always has a lot of things happening in parallel. So tracing is a good way to dig into a specific flow, which is really difficult to do just through the log output that we have now, especially when it's distributed over several gateways. Yuval, would you like to add anything here?
Not really. So, I mean, maybe. One thing is that once we have the main, like the base code in, we have to understand this is going to have to be a collaborative effort, because, I mean, just like you don't expect one person to write all the logs in the system, you can't expect one person to own all the traces in the system. So once the infrastructure is there, like every developer will have to be aware of the tracing and use it. So that's one thing. The other thing is so currently the way to consume the traces is through the Jaeger UI, which could be very very useful for end users, but I think is inconvenient for developers. Like, as most developers, they don't like to use UIs. So we probably need to think about some kind of tooling to make that more easily consumed in non-UI environments. I mean, it's all an Elasticsearch database or something like that, so it shouldn't be a problem. But we should probably think about that to make that also useful for developers, not just for the end users.
Okay, cool. To your first point about developers kind of agreeing how to use these traces, I would like to discuss that further and try to figure out if we can kind of just agree on a policy for what's useful to trace, maybe what's too much tracing, or how we can try to balance it.
Okay.
Anything else here before we move on? Matt, you added this one. Do you have anything to discuss that we haven't? All right, well, I'm excited about this stuff. It's been making great progress. Next is...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Matt. Go ahead.
No. Well, the only thing I'd ask, and one of my aspirations for this is that after it's some that eventually we eventually have the ability to do some kind of conditional tracing, to try to address this sort of theme of what's too much or what are the right traces in the fullness of time, how we can make tracing dynamic enough that we can adapt it to conditions we haven't seen before.
Yes.
Yeah, true.
maybe I'll apply to that. So currently there's a PR going on to show how to do conditional tracing in the for the ops based on Lua. But this can work because we have two things around ops. We have Lua scripts and we have traces. So you need both of them for Lua-based conditional tracing to work. And we would probably need to add them both to other places where we require conditional tracing, because those are the two building blocks that are needed. So like a generic cross-the-board conditional tracing, I'm not sure how that would be possible without adding specific points where Lua scripts can run and make the thing conditional.
Yeah, maybe we could think about something similar to Ceph's log levels and subsystems, so that we have trace subsystems that you can turn on and off, and then you would need Lua for things like I want to trace this specific bucket or this specific user that you couldn't do with like a global log level kind of thing.
Right, that makes sense. Maybe we should also, I mean, I've sent an email to the list, got no response, but maybe we should also add here a point about the cleanup needed for the subsystem and level-based logging.
Asking about conditional tracing, will this be automatically turned on if we are seeing any issue? Because we might see any issue. Yeah.
The idea is that if you want to trace something very specific, so you have a live system where you cannot just turn logging on or tracing on for everything, because that would slow down the entire system and you don't want that. But let's say that do you have a problem with a specific bucket or a specific time of day, or a specific user, or I don't know, some specific object prefix or whatever, like whatever condition that you can think about, you can turn tracing off for the entire system, but turn it on only for whatever combinations of conditions. And you describe those conditions in a Lua script. So you write some Lua code with whatever conditions that you want to upload to the system, and that does the conditional tracing. This is the current thing that we're working on.
To your point, Gaurav, it probably wouldn't be the case that it would magically turn itself, it would automatically turn itself on in a specific condition, although maybe in some extreme case that eventually something like that happens. But more likely, you have a particular kind of problem, and this is a time when we can have some diagnostic tooling that we can reuse, turn it on to help figure out what's going on in this particular case. You could customize it.
I mean, mainly my question was mainly towards the sync issues. If we are seeing any sync issue, can we automatically turn itself on at that particular moment, and maybe that helps us.
It's designed with this kind of idea in mind, right? So that if we were debugging, if a particular bucket is not syncing, like you all was saying, we could inject a trace program that looks for that, looks for other things, and maybe you evolve it, sneak up on the to gradually figure out what's unique about what's happening and get an RCI.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, you can turn on tracing in your script based on whatever condition. The condition could be an error case that you detect, for example. But I don't think that we're going to hard code that to a specific case, because that would be helpful only for a small % of the issues and would not be helpful for other issues. So
yeah, exactly.
But
I think it is important. Like Gaurav is a support engineer or a QA person too, right? But I mean, like if you're a support engineer supporting for RGW object storage and Ceph object storage in field, this would be a toolbox. This would be a toolkit to investigate and get a root cause analysis.
Sure. Thanks, Yuval and Matt.
Yeah, Gaurav, I think that's an interesting idea, and there might be some very extreme cases where we would want to automatically turn on tracing for specific things.
Yeah, mainly I was thinking towards when the issue actually originates, we might want to understand what happened right in the past in detail.
Well, yeah, tracing can't really tell you what happened in the past before you turned it on, though. And in multi-site, it kind of seems like we don't notice errors until after the interesting things happened.
I mean, there is an, I'm not sure we're going to do that, but there is an approach that in problematic areas, you kind of always keep the log or the trace of several actions, and you delete them once you have like a successful completion of something, and like to overcome what you just described, Grace, that you cannot gonna predict the future. So you always keep some of the past. I mean, it probably has some cost, but you can always keep some of the past with you. And if you get an ACK or something, then you just delete it. If you get an error, then you have some kind of a past trace that you can add to the description of the problem. So this could be an approach, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think Ceph's logging system has something similar to this where it will keep the last 10,000 log entries in memory of any log level, even if it's not currently enabled, so that if we crash, it can dump all of that, which is really useful.
Okay.
All right, we're already kind of talking about multi-site, and there's a lot of projects around that as well. The major one that we need to finish is dynamic resharding. I have a link to the PR where we're tracking the feature branch for that. We've got it working in a lot of cases and still trying to figure out all of the places or all of the bugs that we haven't found yet, which is difficult, but part of that is being able to scale up the workloads, and that's definitely kind of another part that we're trying to do at the same time. There's also sync fairness, which has been on the back burner for quite a while, but the goal is to let multiple gateway instances cooperate better to sync things. Currently, they're kind of greedy and just try to lock everything and sync everything. And there's work in progress, at least starting with metadata sync, to make the locking a lot more sane so that they can share the workload and sync overall can perform much better. The FIFO is another one that's been around for a while, written by Yehuda, and Adam plugged it in for the data logs. So that's been around for, I think, since Pacific. But we need to switch out the MD logs as well, and eventually the BI logs. So that should take a lot of load off of OMAP and RocksDB and make these logs a lot cheaper to trim, which has been a big issue with OMAP, especially at scale. The deletes can be problematic. So those are the projects inside of multi-site, but there's also some testing initiatives that I think are important here. I just added this idea of potentially rewriting the multi-site tests in Golang or some other language that can give us some concurrency, because especially with the resharding tests, Python doesn't really let us do a reshard while I/O is happening, which I think is important to catch races. But it's hard to know if it's worth rewriting the tests. I think this needs more discussion. I'd love to hear people's thoughts here. But the other major gap for multi-site testing now is tests for per bucket replication features. It's quite different than the normal tests that we have, which just compare the source bucket with the destination bucket and make sure all their objects are the same. Per bucket replication is a lot more flexible in what syncs where, and so the tests have to track all of that and do the comparisons right. There has been some work to write tests for this, but they need to be, just need to keep working on that. And that's kind of a prerequisite for being able to support per bucket replication by default.
Well, the code is exercised all the time. It's just never really configured. That's difference.
Well, yeah, the main code of syncing a bucket to itself is exercised by default, but there are a lot of corner cases that I don't think we've been exercising at all.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about really the configuration that we need to look at, but yeah.
Any thoughts on using Golang? Do you guys think I'm crazy here?
I think that might be like an overkill for this particular problem. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Golang, but we have everything done in Python. There probably should be a way to, I mean, it's not really a matter of performance, right? So it's not concurrency for the sake of performance. It's just for making sure the two things are happening at the same time. So I'm not an expert in Python, but there should be a way to do that.
Seems appealing to me. I have to say, I don't know how much work it would be.
Yeah, typically the issue with Python is that there have been 20 different ways to do concurrency, but like these days it's a little easy to choose one and do things asynchronously. It's not too bad. If you want to stick with the classic threading sort of model, that's pretty simple to use, and you can even expand it to use multiple processes transparently. Pretty nice. You do need the extra performance.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah,
if you want to load the system, then I would say go with Golang for sure. But just for the concurrency thing, I think we don't need to.
Okay. Yeah, so this issue with the nose test framework has kind of been on our radar for a long time, and we need to find a way around that, even if we do stick with Python tests.
I think the modern replacement typically would be a PyTest, which it's usually pretty simple to drop those in and convert them.
Yeah.
There might be a certain amount of work because there's such a large amount of tests already there, but I think it should be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's I did look into PyTest initially, but some of our scripting to run these tests in Toothology has some specific dependencies on nose that I don't really know how to work around.
Okay, well, maybe we can talk more about that with some folks who are more familiar with Python and knows and whatnot. We can work that out. It should be doable.
Yeah, and there is actually a PR that is trying to remove nose from Ceph entirely, and I was trying to assist there. We ended up splitting off the multi-site test part into a separate PR, so we can discuss it there.
Sure, that sounds good.
Sorry, I don't have a link handy at the moment.
No worries.
Okay, so I'm happy to accept that I'm crazy about Golang. It's probably a lot of work to rewrite these things that would be better spent fixing multi-site. Any other thoughts, multi-site specific, before we move on to workload testing?
Maybe not multi-site specific, but I really like the test plans that you were talking about here and what you sent the dev list. And one thing that I'm not sure if you've written about more is upgrade testing. Like that's an area that we could focus on a lot more across Ceph, but especially in RGW and multi-site, where there are several different formats and protocol changes potentially.
Yeah, definitely. And at least in some form, I have hooked up upgrade tests to multi-site. It's just that our multi-site tests themselves don't pass consistently, so it's not especially useful to run upgrade tests that also fail the same way.
Sure, so you need to fix the basic testing first before
yeah,
go with
exactly.
the upgrade version of it.
And I think test coverage and success rate has been improving on the multi-site reshard branch, just that we haven't merged any of that back to master yet. But I think it's getting better, and eventually we'll be able to turn it back on by default. But yeah, being able to test an upgraded multi-site cluster against a cluster of the previous version, I think is critical. All right, and being able to scale up workload tests, I think, is something that we have been really focusing on around the multi-site reshard testing, because a lot of the issues we weren't able to reproduce in our own environments that QE was seeing in really big workloads. So a lot of work has been done between Yuval and Mark to be able to run vstart and mstart against real hardware and run real workloads against them. I think that's been really productive. And there's also interest in running some workloads in Teuthology itself. I believe that Kalpesh is trying to run Warp for multi-site workloads. I think that doing any kind of scale or performance stuff in Teuthology can be difficult, though, because we don't have a very good I guess control over the performance at that kind of scale. I would be interested to hear more about what other teams are doing for performance stuff there.
One thing that we've been talking about in the Rados team was doing more logical scale testing, where we effectively let BlueStore write zeros to the cluster and let BlueStore just not write those down. So you can kind of run many more daemons with the same amount of hardware and stress the kind of scalability bottlenecks that you might find with a larger cluster without the same amount of data. Would that be something that would be interesting for RGW as well?
Okay, cool, yeah. Yeah, that's a really good idea. And I think there are kind of some parallels that we could do with the zipper abstraction in RGW itself to plug in a similar kind of backend that that we could run workloads against without doing much actual I/O.
Casey, for Teuthology specifically, you're probably best off there with like small tests on a single node. At least that's what we've seen in the past. You tend to get a lot of volatility when you try to do like multi-node tests with really high performance aimed workloads.
Yeah, that's kind of been my impression. Matt, I think you've been working with Kalpesh on the warp workload. Do you can you share what the goals are for that? Is it performance or just trying to scale up our
Well, yeah, I mean, the goal is to capture is mostly to capture best practices, have something there. My real aspiration would be that to concentrate on real workload testing in the scaled up B-Start or some similar or some further scaled version of that used to be possible, and focus on understanding how those workloads progress through and be able to have processes where we run the tests on known equipment frequently. I don't know. Yeah, there's not there wasn't really a plan. I mean, we were trying to capture in some of the things that Kalpesh is doing, and an ability to actually write workload tests that run in Teuthology and make some constructive progress there. But I wouldn't say it was my intuition would be to serialize on make Teuthology do stuff and then track it. Past that hasn't been a super great way to get this.
Yeah. Okay.
But buried in there, there's all kinds of testing we do in downstream, and with the Intel authored framework called CosBench. It was intended to be a kind of a Yahoo, YCSB for object storage, but it's and it can generate big workloads, and it can run them on multiple client submission engines and with their inter-arrival rates. Another tricky policy that you can define in a workload file, and it's a good idea that works well, but is a really real pain in the butt to use, and is orphaned now for almost 5 years, I guess. There's been no bug fixes or anything. It's a giant Java program. So buried in here is switching to the Minio Warp tool, which is a small, more compact, modern workload generator that has some of the same objectives. Seems to work well. So we're doing this puts it in Teuthology where it can get extreme use, and also experiments going on in the Red Hat Workload DFG, basically testing team to sort of replace CosBench for the workloads that they do. We hope to spread those to our QE and so forth. And we're trying, and Red Hat's trying to get its QE, its quality engineering to around object storage and other products to be against Ceph upstream, and really make them upstream processes. So not just against upstream code necessarily, but probably do upstream reporting and things like that. So I think bigger method to the madness there.
Yeah, I definitely agree that Warp is attractive for this, and I'm sure that we can make use of the Sepia lab to run some workloads. I don't know if it necessarily has to be in Teuthology itself, but some automation outside of that maybe. Mark, CBT can do stuff kind of like this, is that right?
So CBT basically, you can either point it at an existing cluster or you can tell it to build a cluster. So if you've already got like stuff installed, it will create a cluster based on a YAML file configuration and then run a bunch of tests against it. Right now, there's this really janky old wrapper for Cosbench, but I don't think it even works anymore. And it was never, I mean, Cosbench is really hard to integrate that way. The other one, we actually have a wrapper for an old benchmark written by Mark Seeger. I don't think anyone probably really uses much anymore, so that's kind of irrelevant. And then we've got one for HSBench, which is the thing I wrote. We could write one for Mini.io, I guess. I don't know if I'm saying it right. I don't have any idea how that works in terms of like, externally telling it what to do. But if you guys were interested, we could try to make a wrapper for it.
Okay, yeah, that sounds promising to me. Even if we're just running the existing HSBench stuff.
Yeah. And the nice thing too then is that if we do it that way, if we do write a wrapper for that other benchmark, it's pretty easy to run both of them.
Yeah, regarding the Min.io thing, I've already, so the person who's working on it, I think his name is Shreyans. He's working with the DFG and they're currently exploring the Min.io workload itself. And I think they've found it much more lightweight and easier to use than Cosbench. I've asked him to come and present it in the performance meeting, and I've also thrown the idea of integrating it with CBT.
Yeah, that seems like a good idea. It's always good to have multiple benchmarks. If you guys have any requirements for HSBench that would make that more useful for you as well, let me know. I can't guarantee I can get to it right away, but I do appreciate feedback on that kind of stuff to try to make the tool more useful.
Yeah, I was wondering what's missing with HSBench. I mean, its performance is pretty high.
My impression is that HSBench is useful for different things, and probably always would be. But like one of the areas that where the Cosbench had value was in sort of defining a sort of a mathematical distribution of the work to be performed in different phases to perform it in, and then managing the normalized results from that. And this sort of warp is sort of similarly constructed, but you line in a bunch of options to it currently to get behaviors. So in that sense, it's a little more like HSBench, but it's a different model internally of how the workload is constructed.
Sure. Do you know? Can you do similar workloads? I mean, I assume that you can probably set it up so that you could do like a similar workload to HSBench. One of the things that we kind of lacked in the past is having multiple tools be able to show like consistently similar results, which would be really nice if we had the ability to do in the future.
I don't think we've tried to do any kind of like big, apples to apples comparison of its modes and those of HSBench, but a little bit more. But I think the workload DFG folks are kind of looking at that way with respect to Cosbench.
Yeah, I'll be honest. When they've run Cosbench, my first reaction is always like, "Oh, geez, I wonder if any of this actually is accurate or not," because Cosbench is such a beast that it's hard to know if it's.
Yeah, like a lot of big software like that, it is a significant generator of load on machines itself.
Yeah,
but it's solving a couple problems we wanted to be able to solve too, and Warp does solve them. Is like you can have you can set things up so that you're submitting a load to a kind of a controller instance, which then spawns additional instances, and they can submit, so you can simulate multiple clients and things like that.
But yeah, I'm definitely not against getting Min.io in or Warp, I guess is probably the name of the benchmark, but getting that into CBT if we can easily kind of set it up from the command line. It'd be nice to have more options there. So definitely let me know how it's going.
All right. Any other thoughts on workload testing and automation?
I guess a couple of considerations about where you might try to run these tests. Like now that Technology does have support in the scheduler for running larger jobs, you could run larger scale things if we had an isolated sort of environment, like a subset of machines we dedicated to performance testing, perhaps, that would not have interference in the network. But I think that might need some more discussion with David Galloway to figure out if that's possible.
Josh, one issue I remember from a long time ago, I don't know if it's still an issue, is that the lab spans multiple switches and the uplinks between the switches weren't super, like, high throughput.
Mm-hmm.
At least in the context of what we do now. So it might be, the topology might matter. I guess is what I'm getting at.
I guess the other thing is that we have the Gable cluster now that's set up for kind of scale testing in general, not necessarily for high performance since it's currently configured to be low resources, but it's we could maybe start there. We wanted to run periodic tests at larger scale.
Yeah, that sounds like a good start. Especially if we're looking at performance, I think it's the most important thing is just that it's reproducible over time so that you're not getting scheduled on different hardware and getting different results.
One other thing too, Casey, that we could be looking at is we have some of the Inserta nodes set up in Jenkins for testing pull requests, and we could look at, right now it's only 4 nodes. They each have 4 NVMe drives and I think 6 hard drives each. But we could potentially add RGW tests there to try to test PRs that have the RGW flag and maybe like a performance flag.
Okay.
So those run CBT, so we could use the existing HS bench tests if that's, would be an interesting thing to try. I think right now it's only doing Crimson tests. There was some effort a while back, I think, to make it test standard classic Ceph as well, but I don't actually know what the status of that or if anyone is still trying to make that work.
Yeah, that is interesting, and it seems like probably the best way to catch performance regressions.
Yeah, I don't know if we only run it when the performance tag is there though, so it might not catch generic stuff. I think we were afraid of how backed up the machines might get, but right now I don't think they're backed up at all. So maybe we should expand that out some.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think there's a couple of different dimensions. One is just looking at performance, and the other is looking at scale. And so the scale part doesn't fit as well in that model.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, shall we move on? I added HTTP3 here as kind of just a longer term effort. Socialized this on the mailing list a little bit a week or 2 ago. But basically we want to eventually have HTTP3 support in RGW. So that means adding a new front end to RGW that can speak QUIC and HTTP3 and also track down S3 clients that actually support it for testing and performance work. So I think there's a lot of stuff to do here, and it probably won't land anytime soon. But I do want to start looking at it over the Reef cycle. The long-term goal would just be to show real performance wins in a big workload. And I think it's going to take a lot of work to get there. But if anybody's interested in helping out with this, let me know. Any other thoughts here?
I think, DC, on the mailing list, you also mentioned potentially adding support for QUIC on the messenger, like in the Ceph messenger. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I don't think that I really know enough about the differences between QUIC and TCP to really say that it would be a win as a Ceph messenger. But I do think it has attractive properties, especially around connection management. It's basically a single UDP socket instead of a ton of different connections to clients.
The two big things we get out of QUIC are much lower latency on connection startup teardown. And I believe it would also, if we do have headed line blocking problems, it would also help with that.
Well, you inevitably do have in the separate protocol and the fits protocols that both Messenger and FRHW do. Which is why, for example, scaled up S3A clients all have sorts of pre-allocated connections that they submit work on.
Yep. So I think there are some concrete advantages. One potential disadvantage is that QUIC is always secure by default, so can only run with TLS. And if it's a Ceph cluster that's on a private network, then that might not be worth paying for.
I think that's already been relaxed at the IETF level in some sense. I'm not sure if that's going to be a permanent issue. Yeah, well, I saw an RFQ about it.
But yeah, I do think that QUIC is interesting to think about as the Ceph messenger, and I think I promised Mark that I would talk about it at one of his performance calls coming up. So I'll do some more research and hopefully follow up there.
Cool. That'd be cool. It sounds kind of exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell how big of a project it would be, but I think it's worth exploring. All right, Yehuda, I think you added sync info provider. Do you want to introduce that one?
Sure. So that's work that we had like years ago, like a couple of years ago that I was working on. There's an open PR for that and waiting for the resharding work to go in. It touches the same stuff. Basically, abstracts the sync APIs that we're using. So instead of like using explicit fetch data log, there's a new API that are defined, and basically lends itself to having non-RGW data sources. There's an implementation that I created for AWS that allows syncing from AWS S3 bucket as an example. Pretty simple, and you can take it different ways. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think there are some really good ideas in there. In kind of the shortest term, I would really like some abstraction just so that we can write unit tests around the sync code. And I think that would be a good start to being able to do that.
Yep. Another thing that it touches is the marker trimming stuff. It changes the logic. So instead of having checking all the targets, if they already sync the data, it's like flips it around. The targets are updating the source with their position after they registered with it. So.
Right, so sync is feeding back its status instead of log trimming having to query status from all of its peers.
Yeah, which kind of makes more sense in terms of later on. The idea is also to have stuff that's not necessarily in the same realm to sync data, and then you probably cannot access those. For example, the AWS endpoint that can sync from, it doesn't make sense to go and query that.
But by the way, are we considering to use the standard AWS client SDK there, or are we going to use our own?
Standard SDK for what?
You're saying that we're fetching objects from AWS?
Right. So but there's an implementation of the Sync Info Provider service that I created. So it's not standard in per-se. Like need to implement a set of APIs that don't exist in S3 in AWS, and AWS itself doesn't give us really granularity that we want to. But in theory, you could create something that is not as efficient, that would do most of the work without much changes. But if you want efficiency in then what I created is probably the way to go.
Okay, I see.
Yep, and unfortunately, this work has been sequenced behind dynamic resharding, which has missed a few deadlines, and so I really look forward to finishing that and pursuing Sync Info Provider again. I think my only feedback right now is that the PR is kind of massive and does a lot of things, and so it would be nice to find ways to break it up and make it more easy to review and consume.
Yeah, I would probably need to build the code once the reshard stuff goes in. We'll need to rebuild the PR differently, like
Sounds good.
Stuff differently.
All right, it looks like we're a little bit over on time, but if people want to stick around, the last point that I added here was just about deprecating features. We talked about adding a lot of new ones, but I think there's some cleanup that we could do. The only one that we've discussed recently is the capability to do the ops log as Rados objects. Can anybody else think of features that are worth deprecating in this next cycle?
We might want to think about deprecating OMAP log for the data log, or we could hold off that until everything's FIFOized.
Yeah, good idea. I don't remember when we set it as the default. Was that for Pacific?
It was the Pacific in the default, yes.
Okay, so that means Pacific and
yeah,
Quincy are both. All right, I think it sounds reasonable for Reef to start removing the OMAP support.
Well, I think it would need to have need to have OMAP support for all the OMAP offload for all the log types. Which we tentatively do, but they should be present. We're going to do that.
Right, for upgrades. That's kind of.
Yeah, I agree. I was talking specifically about the OMAP for data log. That also reminds me that we did some refactoring around the GC logs, and we have some kind of complicated transition logic from OMAP to the GC queue. And as long as that's been in for a couple of releases, I think we can remove support for the OMAP format there. All right, well, this is stuff that we can discuss separately, but I think it's worth thinking about early in the release cycle so that we can communicate what our plans are. So that's all that I have. Anybody else want to ask questions or raise new topics?
Hello, this is Zuhair. I added a comment about PR. Actually, it's related to Zipper. I would like to add Deos support. Deos is a backend similar to how Motor is a backend. It allows like access to like Optane storage and so on. So it was like introduced a couple of weeks ago. The PR is in the chat if someone could like review that. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think we heard about this maybe last week in the refactoring call.
It'll be good to give the Ceph OSD some competition. See how it compares.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to have to see it. Maybe to get a presentation on the use on Dios, sort of a crib sheet on getting it up in interesting configurations, perhaps.
Yeah. For the author of this, do you know Deos these days? I know at one point it didn't actually support any form of replication a long time ago. I don't have any idea what they've been doing recently. Is it what's the model like now?
I believe they do have replication, but it's not in the current implementation doesn't make use of that, but I believe it is available.
Do you know is it synchronous or asynchronous?
I don't know the exact details, but we can chat about this later for sure.
Okay, yeah, sure. I was just curious. That's all.
Cool. And I'd invite you to come to the RGW refactoring meetings and talk about this further.
Yes, for sure. I will do that next week.
Sounds good. All right. Anything else? Thanks a lot, everybody. I'll work on adding some of this new stuff to the Ceph backlog in Trello. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of CDS. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Casey.
Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.